I risk not saying what I believe. That's what I risk. This is one of those defining moments. It really is. People are going to be judged. Where were they before and where were they after the vote? History's going to judge it. It's that consequential. And so the risk is making sure people understand just how important this is. Just how important this is.
President Joe Biden with reporters at the White House throwing his support behind changing Senate filibuster rules to allow voting rights bills to pass with a simple majority. But changing those rules requires support from all 50 Senate Democratic caucus members, and that's not a guarantee at this point. Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Tuesday, January 11th, 2022. President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris traveling to Atlanta to give some speeches on the importance, they say, of passing the Democratic voting rights bills. Back in Washington, the Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell warning that his party will retaliate if the filibuster is changed without their input. We'll have all the latest in just a moment. Also today, Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell testifying before a Senate Banking Committee. His renomination hearing is up for a second four-year term as chair, saying that high inflation is a severe threat to achieving maximum employment in the U.S., but he's committed to taking steps to keep inflation from becoming, as he puts it, entrenched. And with new COVID-19 cases and hospitalizations setting record highs across the U.S., the Biden administration's White House COVID-19 response team testifying on Capitol Hill, the CDC director clarifying guidance for isolation and testing if you test positive. And we start with voting rights. From the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, President and Vice President delivering remarks on the importance of passing federal voting legislation, even if it means revising U.S. Senate rules, so that Republicans cannot use the filibuster to block debate on a bill that will create national standards for election management, redistricting, and campaign finance, or a separate proposal that will reinstate federal review of changes to state and local election laws in municipalities that meet certain criteria, that criteria being past discrimination. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution goes on that Senate leader Chuck Schumer has said he wants a vote on the bills, including any necessary rules changes before Martin Luther King Day, which is Monday. But it doesn't look like he has the support of all 50 Democrats necessary to get that done. Well, the first stop for President Biden and Vice President Harris in Atlanta was laying a wreath at the crypt of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and wife Coretta, and then a nearby tour of Ebenezer Baptist Church, where King was pastor until his death in 1968. Senior pastor now, meeting him at the door, Senator Raphael Warnock, Democrat of Georgia. And after that, it was to Atlanta University Center Consortium on the grounds of historically black schools Morehouse College and Clark Atlanta University. The president, for the first time, saying explicitly he wants the Senate rules changed.
Not a single Republican has displayed the courage to stand up to a defeated president to protect America's right to vote. Not one. Not one. We have 50-50 in the United States Senate. That means we have 51 presidents. You all think I'm kidding. I've been pretty good at working with senators my career, but man, when you got 51 presidents, it gets harder. Any one can change the outcome. Sadly, the United States Senate, designed to be the world's greatest deliberative body, has been rendered a shell of its former self. Gives me no satisfaction in saying that as an institutionalist, as a man who was honored to serve in the Senate. But as an institutionalist, I believe that the threat to our democracy is so grave that we must find a way to pass these voting rights bills. Debate them, vote, let the majority prevail. And if that bare minimum is blocked, we have no option but to change the Senate rules, including getting rid of the filibuster for this. You know, last year, if I'm not mistaken, the filibuster was used 154 times. The filibuster has been used to generate compromise in the past, promote some bipartisanship, but it's also used to obstruct, including especially obstruct civil rights and voting rights. And when it was used, senators traditionally used to have to stand and speak at their desk for however long it took. And sometimes it took hours. And when they sat down, if no one immediately stood up, anyone could call for a vote or the debate ended. But that doesn't happen today. Senators no longer even have to speak one word. Filibuster is not used by Republicans to bring the Senate together, but to pull it further apart. Filibuster is weaponized and abused. While the state legislative assaults on voting rights is simple, all you need in your House and Senate is a pure majority. In the United States Senate, it takes a supermajority, 60 votes, even to get a vote, instead of 50 to protect the right to vote. State legislators can pass anti-voting laws with simple majorities. If they can do that, then the United States Senate should be able to protect voting rights by a simple majority.
President Joe Biden in Atlanta. There had been some reporting ahead of his trip that Stacey Abrams, a civil voting rights activist and Georgia gubernatorial candidate, a Democrat, would not be attending this speech. President saying to reporters before he left that he spoke to Stacey this morning. He said, "We have a great relationship. We got our scheduling mixed up. I talked to her at length this morning. We're all on the same page and everybody's fine." And Stacey Abrams also tweeting her support of this change. Before the trip today as well, some reporting, this from Atlanta Journal-Constitution, a coalition of Georgia voting rights groups says President Biden and Vice President Harris should skip traveling to Atlanta unless they come with a concrete plan to pass federal voting laws immediately. These groups stop short of encouraging a boycott or protest, but say they're going to hold a separate event to react to what the president and vice president say. And that is the question. Is there a workable plan to get the bills passed by changing the filibuster rule to let them pass with a simple Senate majority, 51 votes, instead of a supermajority, 60 votes, which cannot be reached so long as virtually all, if not all, current 50 Senate Republicans are opposing the bills. TheHill.com writes, to change the Senate rules, Democrats need total unity from all 50 of their members, something they don't yet have. Senators Joe Manchin of West Virginia, Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona, both support a supermajority requirement for legislation, while others, including Mark Kelly of Arizona, haven't yet taken a position. Senator Manchin spoke with reporters earlier before the speeches in Atlanta.
Senator, good morning.
Hey guys, I don't really have any.
You plan on watching and listening to what the president says today?
Oh, I'd love to. If I'm not in committee meetings, I will be. Yeah.
Anything he can say to change your mind on filibuster and procedure?
Filibuster is what we have, our rules. We need some good rule changes to make the place work better, but getting rid of the filibuster doesn't make it work better.
Do you get any pressure from your constituents back home on that issue?
Well, no, I mean, what they know about the filibuster is basically what Bob Byrd has educated people on over the years. And the filibuster is what makes the Senate hopefully work when it's supposed to work. We need some good rules changes, and we can do that together. But you change your rules with 2/3 of the people that are present. So it's Democrats and Republicans changing the rules to make the place work better. Getting rid of the filibuster does not make it work better.
Where do things stand with your talks with Senator Collins on the electoral
We're
calendar?
working on that. That's a bipartisan group. We're working on that. Some good stuff.
Senator Joe Manchin, Democrat from West Virginia, with reporters as the senator was heading into a hearing. There's a headline at Politico.com that reads, Dems filibuster conundrum, it's not just Manchin and Sinema. The subhead, Mark Kelly is undecided. John Tester likes a talking filibuster but is not crazy about making an exception for elections reform. And Jeanne Shaheen is promoting more modest changes. All the names on that list, Democrats. Well, the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, saying today at a news conference the votes will go on and will occur as early as Wednesday.
Senator, you clearly don't have Joe Manchin on board, you don't have Kyrsten Sinema on board. They've been very clear they do not support going to the nuclear option. So why go through this exercise, force your members, your vulnerable members, to cast a vote to change the rules when you know it's not going to happen?
Okay, I'd say three things. First, we're still working to get it done. And we are still having, as we speak, active discussions with both Senators Manchin and Sinema. There's a 50-person discussion here. That's number one. Number two, this is so important. Job of a senator is to vote. And the more important and pressing the issue is, the more that plays. We are going to vote.
the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer at a news conference. Over on the Republican side, the senators there are approaching this debate on both fronts. First, to say that the voting rights changes proposed by Democrats are not needed or constructive. And second, the Senate filibuster rule should not be changed. And if it is, there will be Republican retaliation. From the Senate floor, here is Senator John Thune, Republican whip, on that first argument.
Source of the election bill that we will likely vote on this week is H.R. 1. Election legislation that was first introduced by Democrats back in 2019. Back then, Democrats told us our election system was broken and that we needed this bill to fix it. After all, a Republican had won the last presidential election and beat a favored Democrat candidate. Surely that meant that our system was in trouble. But then the 2020 elections came along, and Democrats won the presidency and a majority, albeit a narrow majority, in both houses of Congress. Voter turnout was massive, and a Pew Research Center poll found that 94% of people found it easy to vote. 94%. So all of a sudden, it was pretty difficult for Democrats to claim that our system was broken. But they still wanted to pass their election legislation, so they came up with a new crisis. In 2021, a number of states passed updates to their voting laws, partly because of the challenges and special circumstances that arose as a result of the pandemic. And so Democrats decided that these common sense, mainstream updates represented an unprecedented attack on voting rights.
Senator John Thune of South Dakota, minority whip, speaking on the Senate floor. Changing the filibuster rule in the Senate by voting to change Senate precedent requires only a simple majority of senators, 51, and changing the Senate rules formally would require a two-thirds vote, 67. Changing it by the precedent method has long been called the nuclear option. The Wikipedia entry, nuclear option, has this. Senator Trent Lott, Republican, coined the term nuclear option in March 2003 because the maneuver was seen as a last resort with possibly major consequences for both sides. The metaphor of a nuclear strike refers to the majority party unilaterally imposing a change to the filibuster rule, which might provoke retaliation by the minority party. Well, today on the Senate floor, Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, Republican from Kentucky, warned that is exactly what will happen.
Finally, on a more practical level, I want to make something very, very clear. 50 Republican senators, the largest possible minority, have been sent here to represent the many millions of Americans whom Leader Schumer wants so badly to leave behind. So, if my colleague tries to break the Senate to silence those millions of Americans, we will make their voices heard in this chamber in ways that are more inconvenient for the majority and this White House than what anybody has seen in living memory. Last year, the Senate passed major bipartisan legislation on infrastructure, on hate crimes, on government funding, on competing with China. Last year, senators helped speed through non-controversial nominations. So what would a post-nuclear Senate look like? I assure you it would not be more efficient or more productive. I personally guarantee it. Do my colleagues understand how many times per day the Senate needs and gets unanimous consent for basic housekeeping? Do they understand how many things would require roll call votes? How often the minority could demand lengthy debate? Our colleagues who are itching for a procedural nuclear winter have not even begun to contemplate how it would look.
The Senate Republican leader, Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, on the Senate floor. As this moves forward, and again, the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer saying the votes on the voting rights bills and then possibly changing the Senate filibuster rule could begin as early as Wednesday. Follow the Senate gavel to gavel on C-SPAN 2 television at cspan.org and on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app. One more note about Senator McConnell. Later with reporters, he was asked what his plans were for the future. He said he is going to run for another term as Republican leader. Former Republican President Donald Trump has been publicly calling for McConnell to be replaced. McConnell just won re-election in 2020 to a 6-year term. He's been in the Senate since winning his first term first election in 1984, and he's been Republican leader since 2007. From CNBC, the Department of Justice on Tuesday announced it's forming a unit to combat domestic terrorism as national security officials warn of a persistent and evolving threat of violent extremism within the U.S. The new unit was unveiled days after the first anniversary of the January 6th invasion of the Capitol, when hundreds of former President Donald Trump supporters violently stormed the building and forced lawmakers to flee their chambers, temporarily halting the transfer of power to President Joe Biden. That was CNBC reporting. Justice Department and FBI officials testifying today before the Senate Judiciary Committee about the threat and that new unit. Here is Senator Mazie Hirono, Democrat from Hawaii, questioning Matthew Olson, who leads the Justice Department's National Security Division, about why those convicted in the January 6th attack on the Capitol have not been sentenced with enhanced prison terms as domestic violent extremists.
I'd like to understand the department's approach to prosecuting the perpetrators. My understanding is that prosecutors have not been pushing for the sentencing enhancements available for acts of domestic terrorism. Do the actions of January 6 insurrections qualify for terrorism sentencing enhancement? Mr. Olson.
Senator, the Attorney General last week in a speech here at the Department of Justice talked about the scope and complexity of the January 6th investigation, talking about the more than 700 individuals who've been arrested, more than 325 individuals charged with felonies. Those cases are ongoing and pending. Each case will depend on the specific facts and circumstances of those cases.
Yes,
and whether
excuse me. Mr. Olson, I am running out of time here. So, yes, I understand that it depends on the actual acts that an individual committed. But if that individual committed a crime, such as attacking a police officer, would that person be subject to enhanced sentencing? Could be, right?
It just depends, and it just depends on the facts and circumstances of the case, Senator.
And if it's applicable, would the department pursue enhanced sentencing?
It certainly is true that and as a general matter, the department has pursued enhanced sentencing in terrorism cases over the past several years where it's appropriate.
Matthew Olson is the Assistant Attorney General, National Security Division, questioned by Senator Mazie Hirono. Politico writes that several Republican senators used their questioning in this hearing to embrace and fuel a conspiracy theory that a man present during the January 6th riot, Ray Epps, was secretly a government agent working to gin up the crowd. There's scant evidence supporting that theory, but it has exploded in pro-Trump media outlets, promoting a range of claims that agitators working for the FBI fueled the January 6th assault on the Capitol. That was from Politico. Here is Senator Ted Cruz, Republican from Texas, questioning Jill Sanborn, FBI's Executive Assistant Director, National Security Branch.
How many FBI agents or confidential informants actively participated in the events of January 6th?
Sir, I'm sure you can appreciate that I can't go into the specifics of sources and methods.
Did any FBI agents or confidential informants actively participate in the events of January 6th? Yes or no?
Sir, I can't answer that.
Did any FBI agents or confidential informants commit crimes of violence on January 6th?
I can't answer that, sir.
Did any FBI agents or FBI informants actively encourage and incite crimes of violence on January 6th?
Sir, I can't answer that.
Ms. Sadburn, who is Ray Epps?
I'm aware of the individual, sir. I don't have the specific background to him.
Well, there are a lot of people who are understandably very concerned about Mr. Epps. On the night of January 5th, 2021, Epps wandered around the crowd that had gathered, and there's video out there of him chanting, "Tomorrow, we need to get into the Capitol, into the Capitol." This was strange behavior, so strange that the crowd began chanting, "Fed, Fed, 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 Fed." Ms. Sandburn, was Ray Epps a Fed?
Sir, I cannot answer that question.
The next day, on January 6th, Mr. Epps is seen whispering to a person, and 5 seconds later, 5 seconds after he's whispering to a person, that same person begins to forcibly tear down the barricades. Did Mr. Epps urge them to tear down the barricades?
Sir, similar to the other answers, I cannot answer that.
Shortly thereafter, the FBI put out a public post seeking information on individuals connected with violent crimes on January 6th. Among those individuals, in the bottom there, is Mr. Epps. The FBI publicly asked for information, offering cash rewards leading to information leading to the arrest. This was posted, and then, sometime later, magically, Mr. Epps disappeared from the public posting. According to public records, Mr. Epps has not been charged with anything. No one's explained why a person videoed urging people to go to the Capitol, a person whose conduct was so suspect the crowd believed he was a Fed, would magically disappear from the list of people the FBI was looking at. Ms. Sandburn, a lot of Americans are concerned that the federal government deliberately encouraged illegal and violent conduct on January 6th. My question to you, and this is not an ordinary law enforcement question, this is a question of public accountability. Did federal agents or those in service of federal agent actively encourage violent and criminal conduct on January 6th?
Not to my knowledge, sir.
Thank you.
Senator Ted Cruz questioning Jill Sanborn, FBI Executive Assistant Director, National Security Branch, before today's Senate Judiciary Committee hearing. C-SPAN also covered another hearing at the House Appropriations Subcommittee looking at the Capitol Police Force. Chief Tom Manger and House Sergeant-at-Arms William Walker among the witnesses, saying that they're actively working to root out police officers with extremist views who could pose insider threats, and that they are developing an insider threat awareness program to identify those officers. You can find both hearings in their entirety at our video library, cspan.org. Washington Today continues in a minute.
This week on the Lectures in History podcast, a discussion on women writers and artists during the Civil Rights era. Here's St. Joseph's University professor Catherine Sibley with more.
While many of us associate civil rights activism with men like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and feminist activism with women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Betty Friedan, and Gloria Steinem, such activism needs to be disentangled from these gendered and racialized expectations. Black women, you can kind of see them in the background in that picture, right? Black women, and especially the writers here, made significant efforts that were just as important, and their story helps balance an often male-centered, white-centered narrative.
The Lectures in History podcast. Find it and follow wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app and wherever you get your podcasts. Bloomberg News writes that Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell pledged to do what's necessary to contain an inflation surge and prolong the expansion while steering clear of fresh details on the path of U.S. monetary policy. Both Republicans and Democrats have expressed concern that the Fed is overstimulating the economy with low rates and bond purchases as inflation runs far above officials' 2% target. That from Bloomberg. Jerome Powell testifying today at his confirmation hearing before the Senate Banking Committee. He's up for a second four-year term as Fed chair. In his opening statement, he promised that high inflation would not stick around forever.
Today, the economy is expanding at its fastest pace in many years, and the labor market is again strong. As always, challenges remain, Both the individual shutdown and the subsequent reopening of the economy were without precedent. The economy has rapidly gained strength despite the ongoing pandemic, giving rise to persistent supply and demand imbalances and bottlenecks, and to elevated inflation. We know that high inflation exacts a toll, particularly for those less able to meet the higher costs of essentials like food, housing, and transportation. We are strongly committed to achieving our statutory goals of maximum employment and price stability. We will use our tools to support the economy and a strong labor market and to prevent higher inflation from becoming entrenched.
That's the Fed Chair Jerome Powell before the Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee. Many of the senators' questions focusing on inflation, including this from committee ranking Republican Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania.
Chairman Powell, we all noted with great interest the shift in the Fed's focus, the acceleration of the tapering, and the indication that FOMC members expect now a series of interest rate increases this year. I'm trying to understand where this leads to, and I wonder if you could comment on the fact that if we had 3 or even 4 25 basis point increases in overnight rates, we would still, in my view, have a very accommodative stance with negative real short-term rates. Is it your view that it's realistic to bring inflation back to the target level if short-term interest rates are negative, real rates?
So the way I would look at it is this. What we have now is a mismatch between demand and supply. We have very strong demand in areas where supply is constrained, particularly around goods, particularly around things like cars. So we have to, how are those two things going to get into better into alignment? Well, part of the answer is going to be through shifts in demand, and we think that part of it will be through the return of greater supply. So I don't think we look to get all of the realignment between demand and supply through the demand channel, although we should get some. But at the same time, we do think we'll get, over the course of this year, return to normal supply conditions, and that's going to affect our policy. I will say, though, if we see inflation persisting at high levels longer than expected, then we will, if we have to raise interest rates more over time, we will. We will use our tools to get inflation back, and the main reason is this, that to get the kind of very strong labor market we want with high participation, it's going to take a long expansion. We can see that participation is moving only very slowly, and to get a long expansion, we're going to need price stability. Right. And so in a way, high inflation is a severe threat to the achievement of maximum employment and to achieving a long expansion that can give us that.
Fed Chair Jerome Powell questioned by Senator Pat Toomey. Another senator on the Banking Committee, Bob Menendez, Democrat of New Jersey, asking what role the COVID-19 pandemic and our ability to get control of it has had on inflation.
Do you expect inflation to subside as vaccinations increase and supply chains are repaired?
Over time, yes. Over time. The question is how fast, and the risks that we're running in the meantime that inflation psychology starts to get entrenched. But certainly I believe that. And you make a great point about vaccination. Getting ahead of the pandemic, I mean, I don't think 2 years ago we thought we'd still be having record levels of cases and even close to record levels of hospitalizations. Getting past the pandemic is the single most important thing we can do.
More now on Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell's testimony before the Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee. Nick Timiraos is the chief economics correspondent with the Wall Street Journal. Thanks for joining us. Before we get to what the Fed chair said about the economy, this was a confirmation hearing. He's up for a second term as Fed chair. Anything from today put that in jeopardy?
No. In fact, to the extent there were any questions about whether Jay Powell would be confirmed to a second term, the hearing put those to rest because, inflation's high and nobody likes that. And interest rates are going to go up, and Democrats may not like that. And yet lawmakers on both sides of the aisle had a lot of positive things to say about the Fed leader.
On inflation, we went through a period last year where the debate was over the word transitory. Is inflation transitory? I guess today the word that stood out is entrenched.
Yeah, entrenched would be the opposite of transitory, and it would be a state of affairs that would be quite troubling to the Fed. The challenge for the Fed right now is that inflation initially went up last year because of these idiosyncratic price increases for things like used cars. Used cars went up 40%, and that's not a small part. Vehicles are not a small part of the consumer price basket. The Fed doesn't expect that to happen again this year and next year, and so initially they thought, okay, these should go away on their own. The concern now, though, is that because the labor market is getting very tight and employers are having to compete for workers by raising wages, wages and rents, shelter costs, those are things that are not, once those begin to rise, they don't usually dip back down as the economic cycle matures. And so the concern the Fed has is even if inflation, and there could be a report Wednesday that it's as high as 7%, even if it were to dip back down to 4% or 3%, as some of these idiosyncratic increases in the price of goods unwind this year, if you see stickier, more persistent inflation from wages and rents, then it becomes harder for the Fed to argue that inflation is going to go down on its own. In fact, you risk getting into the kind of wage and price spiral that began in the late 1960s, that we had in the 1970s, and then the Fed would really have to slow down the economy by raising interest rates a lot more than they're planning to raise interest rates right now.
This is coming as the COVID-19 Omicron variant surge is happening, and the political leaders are not talking about more lockdowns. But is what the Fed is doing and how they're responding sort of separate from what COVID is doing, since there'll be no lockdowns?
Yes, and Powell made that point in the hearing. Sometimes, especially early on in the pandemic, every time we had a virus wave, people thought, okay, this is going to lead to even more stimulus, right? Because economic growth is going to slow down. But what we saw last year with the Delta wave and what the Fed is sort of penciling in right now for Omicron is, yes, there might be a short-term hit, in these weeks in which cases are very high and there's staffing shortages and things like that. But the economy has shown we are going to live with this thing, right? We are not China. We're not Australia, where we're going into hard lockdowns and having kind of a zero COVID posture. That's not what the United States has been doing. And so the economy has been much more resilient as these virus waves roll through.
We're talking with Nick Timiraos of the Wall Street Journal. It's interesting that Jerome Powell was chosen 10 years ago to be on the Fed by a Democratic president, Barack Obama, and then 4 years ago to be chair by Republican President Donald Trump, and now renominated as chair by a Democratic president. What can be said about the Fed or about Powell when you look at that?
Yeah, if there's somebody else in a top kind of government policy position who was appointed by Obama, reappointed by Donald Trump, and reappointed by Joe Biden, I haven't encountered that person. It speaks, I think, to the unique skill set that Jay Powell has brought to this job. A lot of times, the types of people you see leading institutions, central banks like the Fed, there's kind of a priesthood of central bankers, and Jay Powell did not come from that group. He worked in finance, in private equity. He worked in the first Bush administration in the early 1990s. He's got a very unique temperament. He has spent an inordinate amount of his time as chair meeting with members of Congress, and you've really seen that pay off because members of Congress like him, and he pledged at his hearing today to continue to do that. I think it's a big part in why he was so popular among lawmakers last fall that and the economic situation is as complicated as it is. It was difficult for President Biden to switch horses, if you will, at this point in time, and really to the extent that Powell wanted a second term, those relationships he has had with lawmakers really paid dividends.
Nick Timiraos is chief economics correspondent with the Wall Street Journal. Find his stories at WSJ.com. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
On Wall Street today, the Dow was up 183, Nasdaq up 210, S&P up 42. United States setting a new record for COVID-19 cases, 1.5 million reported on Monday, according to data from Johns Hopkins University. And also a new record for hospitalizations, now more than 145,000. That comes from the Federal Health and Human Services Department. And with the Omicron variant winter surge racing across the country, a new poll finding 88% of people say they personally know someone who's tested positive for COVID-19. The poll was done this week by Axios and Ipsos. Members of the White House COVID-19 response team testified today before the Senate Health Committee. Senator Patty Murray is the committee chair, asking the CDC director, Dr. Rochelle Walensky, about her agency's guidance on isolating and testing after a positive test.
I have heard from so many people who find the latest CDC isolation and quarantine guidance confusing and hard to interpret. So, Dr. Walensky, can you please clearly explain CDC's latest guidance on what people need to do to protect themselves and others if they are exposed to or contract COVID-19? And let me start with vaccinated people. What is your guidance to them?
Thank you, Chair Murray, for the opportunity to clarify. Maybe if I could just rewind the clock to just before the holidays, where we were hearing from hospitals that their staff were going out and that they were in a real crunch in terms of beds. They had plenty of beds, but they didn't have staff to staff them. ICU beds were starting to close. So immediately we worked towards our updated healthcare worker guidance. But when we did so, we recognized that we were going to have challenges and that this Omicron surge that we were about to face was threatening many other places of our healthcare sector.
I appreciate the background, but I just want to know, straightforward, if someone is exposed to or has COVID-19 and they're vaccinated, what do they do?
If they are exposed to COVID-19 and they are completely boosted, they do not need to stay home, but they should get a test at day 5. If they have COVID, our guidance does not distinguish between your vaccination status. And our science has demonstrated that you're maximally infectious 2 days before and 2 to 3 days after. So by 5 days after your symptoms, if you're feeling better, if your fever is better, if your cough and sore throat are better, then on day 6, you can go out, but you have to wear a mask. You have to wear a mask reliably, and you should not go to places you can't wear a mask. You probably shouldn't go and visit grandma. You shouldn't get on an airplane.
For vaccinated, what about unvaccinated?
Same for unvaccinated for isolation. So isolation being those who have had disease, who have disease.
Dr. Rochelle Walensky heads the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, questioned by Senator Patty Murray, Democrat from Washington State, at today's hearing. Another issue that came up, Biden administration's plans to ship 500 million free at-home COVID-19 tests to Americans. The first contracts have been signed, but Senator Richard Burr, Republican of North Carolina, asking Dawn O'Connell from the Health and Human Services Department, Assistant Secretary, why the companies chosen don't have much experience.
So the president makes an announcement, Ms. McConnell, of 500 million at-home tests. Is this the first time that you've thought about purchasing an at-home test, or have you tried to before and it was rejected?
Thank you, Ranking Member Burr. This is the first time the administration has committed to purchasing tests to send to the American households.
So is that ASPR or is that DOD? Because of all the notifications of contracts signed, I've seen them from DOD. I haven't seen them from HHS.
Thank you for that question, Ranking Member Burr. We have a relationship with DOD for assisted acquisitions. So ASPR will request that DOD put out a solicitation or manage a contract on our behalf. They're able to do it extraordinarily quickly. And we've had an MOU in place with DOD for this work that will run through June 2023. We've used this relationship to purchase vaccines and therapeutics, and we're now using it for testing.
So the best I can find, you mentioned 50 million doses having been contracted. I can identify 27 million out of two companies, Media and Atlantic Trading. Neither one of them are manufacturers of test. And I believe the third one, Revival, is not a manufacturer of test. Media actually came to fame was importation of vodka and tying cell phones to vodka. And like a lot of other companies, they got in the PPE business in 2020 with some nominal FEMA contracts. Why should we have any confidence in these contracts if, in fact, we're dealing with companies that don't manufacture anything? And can you assure me that the tests that are coming in are not coming from China?
Thank you, Ranking Member Burr. Absolutely. These tests, what we initially did to be able to access tests for the initial shipments that will go towards the end of January, we worked with warehouses to see where additional tests were stored and assessed that additional capacity and are bringing that capacity to bear for these initial tests that are going out, which is why you're seeing contracts with warehouses and not with test manufacturers.
So is what you're telling me they've got 50 million tests in warehouses in the United States and all we did was access that inventory?
That is my understanding.
Dawn O'Connell, Assistant Secretary of Health and Human Services, questioned by Senator Richard Burr, the ranking member on the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. Also testifying at today's hearing, Dr. Anthony Fauci, the head White House science advisor. And like some hearings in the past, he got into a heated exchange with Senator Rand Paul, Republican from Kentucky, who's also a doctor. Paul accusing Fauci of trying to discredit some other doctors who disagreed with him.
In an email exchange with Dr. Collins, you conspire, and I quote here directly from the email, to create a quick and devastating published takedown of three prominent epidemiologists from Harvard, Oxford, and Stanford. Apparently, there's a lot of fringe epidemiologists at Harvard, Oxford, and Stanford. And you quote in the email that they, or from Dr. Collins, and you agree that they are fringe. And immediately there's this takedown effort. A published takedown, though, doesn't exactly conjure up the image of a dispassionate scientist. Instead of engaging them on the merits, you and Dr. Collins sought to smear them as fringe and take them down. And not in journals, in lay press. This is not only antithetical to the scientific method, it's the epitome of cheap politics, and it's reprehensible, Dr. Fauci. Do you really think it's appropriate to use your $420,000 salary to attack scientists that disagree with you?
The email you're referring to was an email of Dr. Collins to me. If you look at the email
that you responded to and hurried up and said, I can do it. We got something in Wired magazine.
No. I think in usual fashion, Senator, you are distorting everything about me.
Did you ever object to Dr. Collins' characterization of them as fringe? Did you write back to Dr. Collins and say, no, they're not fringe, they're esteemed scientists, and it would be beneath me
I did not
to do that? You responded to him that you would do it, and you immediately got an article in Wired, and you sent it back to him and said, hey, look, I've got him. I nailed him in Wired of all scientific publications.
That's not what went on. There you go again. You just do the same thing every hearing.
That was your response. And this wasn't the only time. So your desire to take down people...
You're absolutely incorrect. As usual, Senator, you are incorrect almost everything you said.
No.
That's the part of the heated exchange between Dr. Anthony Fauci, director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, and Senator Rand Paul at today's Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee hearing. That went on for several more minutes. We have the entire video at cspan.org. Also included Dr. Fauci saying that he has received obscene phone calls and threats upon my life, all because people are lying about me. And Fauci also accusing Senator Paul of attacking him for political purposes, showing a screenshot from Senator Paul's campaign website with a call to fire Dr. Fauci alongside links to donate to the campaign. Also in COVID news today, House Democratic Caucus Chair Hakeem Jeffries announcing that the annual House Democratic Caucus Issues Conference, also known as the Retreat, scheduled for February 9th through 11th in Philadelphia, will be postponed. It's due to COVID-19 and based on guidance from the Office of the Attending Physician of the U.S. House. Thanks for listening today to Washington Today. To get more top stories from Washington sent to you each day, subscribe to C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word at c-span.org/connect. Hope you have a good night.